Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to our Reviewed and Ranked series. Today, we make the official transition from the characters included in the base game to the extra characters. And this week and next week, we will be focusing on the free update characters before transitioning over to the paid DLC. So if you're enjoying this series, make sure that you subscribe as there's still a couple videos left in it. And if you enjoyed today's video or found it helpful or interesting, make sure that you hit that like button. So today's character of focus is Cyclops. And Cyclops is a very interesting character for a couple of different reasons. But the thing with Cyclops is his playstyle is very interesting because though his standard attacks for the most part are up close and personal, he does have a very good amount of range capable with him. As a matter of fact, I would say that he is probably the most capable ranged fighter in this game, and he's a lot more balanced than characters such as Elsa Bloodstone and Hawkeye and other projectile heavy characters, range heavy characters that we've looked at up until this point because of that little hybridization and just the way that the characters were designed. So let's start with looking at the team build synergies that Cyclops has. He actually has 6 of them, and they are fairly well balanced all things around. He has 2 strength synergies with X-Men and all new X-Men. He has a defense synergy with family values, an energy synergy with team leaders, a mastery synergy with sharpshooters, and a resilience synergy with first class X-Men. It's really nice to see characters that have a decent amount of balance to their team build synergies, and between the strength, energy, and mastery synergies that Cyclops has, he's actually a decent option for padding out your team, because if you're looking for a more offensive build to the team and bolstering your overall damage output potential, that is going to increase that cap by a nice little margin. Let's talk about the way that Cyclops works before we get into his particular abilities. His standard attack sequence involves 3 strikes with his hands and feet, and that last strike in his 4-hit basic combo is an Optic blast that hits out in front of him, and it has a considerable amount of range to it. It doesn't shoot off endlessly, but that's kind of expected because that would just be a little bit too overpowered if he could be on one side of the battle arena and strike opponents on the other side. But he does have other options that allow him to do that, which we will talk about later. Cyclops' heavy attack is a sweeping Optic blast where he will look over to the left, engage an Optic blast, and then sweep over about 90 degrees towards his right. And unlike other characters in this roster where you either have the standard attack sequence and the heavy attack is very separate, or perhaps substituting that heavy attack at the very end of the basic attack sequence for enhanced damage per second, you can just follow in with a heavy attack after completing a standard attack sequence. The one downside to using the heavy attack, whether in that scenario or as a standalone, is it has a fair amount of startup compared to other attacks and heavy attacks from other characters on the team, and Cyclops is immobile during that head sweep, so he is very open to retaliation from mighty attackers and other characters that might be up close. When it comes to the grunt type enemies or the standard opponents that you run into periodically throughout the many different combat segments, he's not a bad option for crowd control. And you still have the options of layering into your opponents both from a up close and personal point of view, as well as creating some distance with the heavy attack as well as the abilities, which we will cover in just a bit. Cyclops does have a mid-air double jump, which is a roll that allows him to have a little bit more versatility when it comes to traversing some trickier parts of the game. And that is always a good thing to see because there are several different puzzles and traps, such as the laser grids, that are a little bit tedious to get around if your character doesn't have some form of mid-air maneuverability. So always like to see characters that have that component, if not a different traversal option. Cyclops' falling aerial is not great, and the biggest reason why is it has a very specific focal point. Sure, it does give Cyclops a back blast and can serve as a retreatment option, but if you're going to deliberately make a choice to retreat, there is an ability that he possesses that does a much better job. Sure, it uses some of your energy points as a trade-off, whereas the falling aerial does not, but it's not a really good option, especially because Cyclops is never put in a circumstance where he would be able to use that falling aerial organically. So I would encourage you to shy away from this, though there's always going to be some opportunities that you can find where it is of a benefit. But with Cyclops especially, if you're going to go for a falling aerial, you might as well use one of his abilities that does a much better job. And Cyclops' block and dodge is fairly standard. It has that two-armed brace cross in front of him to mitigate oncoming attacks from his opponents, and as he dodges out of the way, he does a very standard combat roll, consistent with a large majority of the cast that we've looked at. So now it's time for us to talk about Cyclops' abilities. And the first ability is the Optic Blast. This is a continuous laser blast beam in the direction that Cyclops is facing. And it is unique amongst the beam synergy traits across the cast, because most beam traits can be manipulated angularly and changed around, whereas Cyclops, he is mobile during this attack, but he is locked into the direction that he is facing. So you can jump and sidestep forward, backward, and side to side while using this attack, but you cannot change the angle of attack for that. And I actually think that makes it inferior to the other beam type synergy attacks that we've seen from the likes of Iron Man and others. And it's just kind of unfortunate. I get that it's unique to him, but there are much better options with that particular synergy trait and attacks that work like this. However, having gone on a soapbox rant about this ability and how I feel like it's weak, you really shouldn't be using this ability from Cyclops anyway, because he has much better abilities in his kit that can be infinitely more effective than this Optic Blast, as well as dealing a lot more damage. This ability has a very abysmal rating to both damage and stagger damage, having F classifications in both of those zones, whereas it is a little bit friendlier on the energy points consumed while using the ability, having a B classification. And this attack is of the energy type, which is consistent across all of Cyclops' attacks because they all revolve around the optic beam in some form or another. This one particularly has that beam trait, and consistent with all of Cyclops' abilities, as they are ranked up, they benefit from a reduced energy point cost, an increase to attack damage, an increase to the damage dealt to the stagger gauge, and finally that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Cyclops' second ability is the triple shot, and this is the ability that I was alluding to when I said that Cyclops has better options when it comes to a falling aerial type attack. Not only does this attack still give Cyclops the option to retreat back and create space away against his opponents, but it has a lot more range and damage output, as it has 3 different blasts that are all let out in a line out in front of the character instead of just having a singular focal point out in front of where he is. This ability is a lot less situationally demanding than the falling aerial is. And furthermore, the area of contact of those blasts do have a kind of an explosive detonation area, which allows it to hit more out horizontally in addition to the increased range that this attack has. This attack has the energy attack type and the launch synergy trait, mainly due to the fact that it doesn't necessarily launch the opponents as much as it does launch Cyclops back and allows him to retreat away from the action. And it has much more respectable stats, having a B classification to damage, a less than great D classification to stagger damage, and finally that C classification to the energy points consumed. Cyclops' third ability is the Eyes Wide Open, and this is a very good ability for Cyclops to possess. It's not as much of a retreating option as it is a very effective amount of crowd control, where he will shoot a scattered beam in more of a planar area, a cone out in front of the character, and you can determine the area that you outlet this attack while the attack is charging up, and you can rotate a little bit from left to right as you charge the attack. When used in a synergy type format, this will detonate immediately in the direction that Cyclops is facing, but that's not a reason to shy away from it because it's still a very powerful and very efficient attack. And it covers a lot of ground as well. The only downside, again, is it has a decent amount of startup to it and it locks Cyclops in place. So I guess that is one benefit of the Optic Blast. If you are locked into that attack, despite the fact that it has abysmal damage, you are at least mobile during it and able to move away from opponents that might be attempting to retaliate against you. But when it comes to damage, this attack is one of the best ones at Cyclops' disposal. This has, again, the energy attack type, and it has the bash synergy trait, though I would have personally liked to have seen the burst synergy trait applied to this a little bit better. Cyclops' fourth ability is the Ricochet beam. This is the only attack in Cyclops' kit that cannot be synergized, and I really, really wish that it could be. However, as cool as this attack is, it is very situational because you're not always going to be in combat arenas or zones where you're going to be able to take advantage of the beam ricocheting off of the arena. I've showcased here one of the best applications for this ability because it is a very small, circularly enclosed room, and you are guaranteed to hit your opponent at least twice, if not more times. There's even one moment here where I get it to perfectly ricochet back and forth against two parallel walls, and it racks up a very nice amount of damage against the target Juggernaut here. The beam that ricochets around the arena can bounce off of up to 6 surfaces before it dissipates and lets out, and it's a lot of unhinged chaos. In certain circumstances, this is definitely the best attack in Cyclops' kit, but again, it requires a lot of spatial awareness and is highly situational based off of the area that you find yourself in, because more often than not, you are not going to be in an area where it is conducive to be able to use this ability just due to the lack of surfaces that the beam can ricochet off of, as well as not being able to have as much control over it as you wish you probably could. This attack, once again, has that energy synergy trait and maintains fairly consistent stats with the previous 2 abilities of Cyclops's, having that B classification to damage, D classification to stagger damage, and C classification to energy points consumed. Cyclops's extreme attack is not the greatest, but again, it does have a very nice amount of range to it. This does have an Optic Blast that has more of that infinite range that you were perhaps hoping for with some of the other abilities of his. It consists of 2 smaller Optic Blasts that Cyclops does in kind of an X-type slash before a massive, overwhelming blast takes place in a direct line and a very wide field of influence out directly in front of the character. Now, again, the biggest downside with this attack is wherever Cyclops is, he will immediately detonate the attack wherever he's facing, so you need to make sure that he is facing in a direction where you can get the most bang for your buck with this attack. But it has a lot of damage potential if you are able to do that, especially if you can consolidate a lot of your opponents into one central area in order to make them all increasingly vulnerable to this particular extreme attack. So having discussed everything that Cyclops has to offer, we need to determine where he lands on this tier list. And like I said, he is the best example of what a ranged character should be in terms of the damage that they're able to put out, which certainly outclasses him above Hawkeye, Elsa Bloodstone, and other projectile characters among the cast. Those are the biggest 2 that we've looked at to this point, but there are a few more that we'll cover in the coming weeks. However, there are a couple of missed opportunities with Cyclops' kit, and I feel like if they would have gone a slightly different route with a couple of his abilities, mainly being able to synergize that Ricochet beam, as well as either beefing up the Optic Blast or making it work differently or completely replacing it with just a more functional ability, that would have really helped to bolster his efficiency across the cast. So I'm a little bit disappointed with some missed opportunities of what could have been done with Cyclops, but that doesn't answer the question as to where he belongs within this tier list. And I think he is definitely above the capacity of these characters here in C tier, but that's about as high up as I would put him. So I will place Cyclops right here at the tail end of B tier, and I do think that Spider-Gwen has him beat just a little bit because she can at least ensnare some of her opponents and allow for a bit more follow-up from the other members of the team. Whereas Cyclops, he, despite being a team leader, has a very lone wolf type strategy, and that's reflected within his own abilities. But what do you think? Do you think that I have undersold Cyclops? Do you feel like there's anything that I missed with his kit? Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you made it this far into the video, don't forget to drop that like. Thanks again for your time, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.